Hello everyone, welcome to Never Stop Growing. I'm Jonathan Harrigan. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the basics of shading. So we're going to go through understanding the value scale, understanding lights and darks, some of the basic tools that you're going to want or need when shading an object or drawing an object with value. And then we're going to talk about some of the terminology and things that you need to look out for whenever you're looking to shade an object. And then lastly, I'm going to show you how these things work in real life. So let's jump into it. The first thing you're going to need is a ruler, because we're going to start off with a value scale. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take a ruler and we are going to measure out 10 inches on your paper. And then you're going to make a mark at every inch along the way. So you should have a box that is an inch wide, or 10 boxes that are an inch wide. And then what you're going to do is you're going to surround your ruler, or make your box about the width of your ruler. And when you're finished, it should look something like this. Okay, so now I'm going to label my boxes 1 through 10. And I'm going to make my darkest value on the left and my lightest value on the right. And my darkest value should essentially be as dark as I can go, so it should be pretty much black. And the lightest value, which will be 10, will be the color of the paper, so white. So once I've laid these in and I'm ready to begin, I'm just going to start shading. And I'm going to go from dark again here at the 1, all the way to light at the 12. And I'm just going to start with my darkest value, and I'm going to speed this up so that you guys don't have to watch all of it, but make sure that you're starting with your darkest value and going to your lightest value. You can also kind of go dark and then go straight to your light and kind of meet somewhere in the middle. But I find that it's best to start with your darkest value and then to go to your lightest value. And the key here is to not try to do this all in one go, but to layer in your color, layer in your values. So start with a really dark value and then try and match that the best you can, like the next step down, right? So a little bit lighter. But if you don't get it and you draw it in a little too light, that's okay. Just come back over it again and darken it up. And you just want to keep doing that until you have a nice gradual gradation from black to white, right? And the key here is to know how hard you're pressing with your pencil, and to try and get that whole range of values. So that's really the thing you're practicing here, is trying to figure out how hard you need to press with your pencil in order to achieve the value that you need. Okay, so once you finish putting in your values and you have them all right, in order to get it to look smooth and have a nice gradation, you're going to need to blend it together. And you can see here I'm using a blending stump to blend it. And in a minute here I'll tell you some other alternatives if you don't have a blending stump at home. But if you do, then this is a great way to kind of blend it together, and that's how you get a nice smooth gradation and you get a nice smooth surface look. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is some of the tools that you might need in order to blend this and make it smooth. And you've already seen me use the blending stump, which is what I prefer and which is what I would recommend. But if you don't have a blending stump, you can use tissue paper, or you can even use a brush in a pinch, although I don't really recommend that. It's kind of better for charcoal instead of graphite. But if, again, you don't have a blending stump at home, you of course can use a tissue or toilet paper, and it works pretty well. Okay, so the next part I've sped up for you, and in this part we're just going to talk about some of the terminology and the things that you should be looking for pretty much whenever you're looking to shade something. These are the things that you should keep in mind and that you should be looking out for. So you'll notice the first thing that I look for here is a light source, and that is the direction that the light is hitting the object. This won't always be right on, but for our example here, we're going to figure out where the light source is, and we're also going to figure out where the cast shadow is. So you can see I've labeled in the light source and the cast shadow, and we're kind of just figuring out like where that would land on the table. Okay, so then I just begin to add in the values, and remember that wherever direction your light source is coming from, it's going to be darker on the opposite side. That seems like an obvious thing, but remember that that's probably where the darker values are going to be. So we're going to lay in our values, and remember, just like we did for your value scale, go ahead and lay them in layers. Don't try and get the exact value right away, but lay them in. You can lay them in lightly at first and then go back over them and lay them in darker if you didn't feel like you got the value right. So you can see here that I'm just going back through and I'm adjusting the places that I feel like need to go darker, specifically down here at the bottom, right, and over here on the side. Remember that, again, the opposite area of your light source is going to be darker, and then I'm laying in or pulling out some of the areas that need to be a little bit lighter. And then we'll come back over through and we'll just smooth things out with our blending stump, just to give it a nice smooth surface. All right. And when you're finished, it should look something along this line, right? And we'll come back through here and we'll begin to label in what we need to. Okay, so again, the first thing you need to make note of is your light source right here and your cast shadow. And then you're going to take the lightest part, so this spot right here on our ball is the brightest spot, and that is called your highlight. All right, so the brightest spot on your object or image is going to be your highlight. And that's really important to identify as well. And then as we go down, the darkest place right here is going to be called your core shadows, or your core shadow. All right. And that's going to be the darkest place pretty much on your image. Okay, so the next place you're going to look is in between your highlight and your core shadow are going to be your midtones. These are going to be your midtones. Or your halftones. They're also called halftones. Okay. And then lastly, what you're going to focus on is this bright spot right here. Is actually some light that is reflected off the table. And when you have light that is not coming from your light source, like directly, it's not your highlight, it is called reflected light, and you'll find that throughout many objects that you have will have some type of reflected light, depending on the surface that it's around or the surface that it's on. Okay, so this is the basic terminology of everything you kind of need to know when you're looking at shading. And while this isn't everything, it is a good starting point for a beginner or somebody that's just getting started. So if you keep these things in mind when you're looking at what you're drawing, whether it's a still life or a photo or something like that, it'll really help you to get the volume of that object or person or thing. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is, what does this look like in real life? What does it look like when you don't have a perfect cylinder? What does it look like with a complex shape, or maybe even complex lighting? So we're going to jump into that here momentarily. Okay, so in the upper left-hand corner, you're going to see that this is the photo that we're going to be working with for our real-life example. And this is just a mug that I had lying around, and I took a photo of it, and I put some pretty strong directional light on it. And you can see that the light source is coming from the right-hand side, and it's giving a decent cast shadow. It's not super strong, but it's a decent cast shadow on the left. And if you have the option, I would recommend always giving yourself a pretty strong cast shadow or a pretty strong light source. It just makes it a little bit easier, especially when you're starting out, to be able to identify kind of the places that you need to shade, and to give your object or piece a sense of volume. So what you'll see me doing here first is coming through and identifying where, like, the general shape of the object first, and then identifying kind of where the shadows are and dividing those up into spaces. So specifically the darkest shadows, and then going through and identifying the highlights and kind of reflected lights of the handle and the rim. Okay, and then after I've done that and I've kind of placed in just the general placement of the shadows, then I'll go back through and I begin to lay in the shadows, right? And I begin to shade them in. And I'm just tacking in the darkest darks and then kind of the general mid-tones. I'm not really worrying too much about the highlights because I'll come back through later and I'll adjust those with the blending stump. Remember that as you go, that your background is oftentimes as important as the foreground. So you'll see me over on the right hand side kind of just sketching out or shading the edge of that mug, and that little edge will kind of define where the right hand side of the mug begins and ends. Okay. So I'll just come back through and I lay in the cast shadow really quick, and then remember that you're constantly refining your piece. Everything starts out pretty rough and then it is constantly refined and refined and refined. So once you've laid in your shape and you've checked and you've made sure that looks correct, go back through and make sure your shadows are correct, right? So lay them in lightly, and just like we did for the value scale, lay them in lightly, and then go back through and as you're softening those up with the blending stump, make sure that those values are correct. Also, another point here that I want to make is that you will more than likely have a value everywhere except for your highlight. Your highlight is going to probably be the only place on your image that is actually the white of the page. So that, and maybe some of your reflected shadows, your reflected light. But otherwise, everything else should have some basic type of shading, even if it's just very, very subtle. Okay, so whenever you're drawing, I think one of the last things to remember is just to be patient. You're going to have to come back through and adjust. You can see me coming back with my eraser and pulling out some of those places that need to be a little bit lighter. And then you'll see me come back through with the pencil and darken up some of the places that I thought needed to go a little bit darker, right? So make sure that your shape, before moving on to your shadows, make sure your shape is correct. And then once you've moved on to your shadows, make sure that your shadows, the values of those shadows look right, okay, or look correct. So that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the basic rundown. So what we're gonna do here is I'm gonna identify for you some of the things we talked about in the previous example. Of where those shadows would be, or where those terms would be on this object. Okay, so the first thing you're going to see me tack in here is the midtone. So right here, it would be an example of our midtone. It's right between a core shadow and a highlight, right? Right here, one of the darker places is going to be an example of a core shadow. Right, and you can see that it's pretty much on the opposite side or on the other side of a midtone, right? There's a nice gradation. That's kind of an easy way to recognize that it's a core shadow. It's also one of the darkest shadows. Okay, so the next thing we're going to see is the light source. So over here is our light source. Again, we already talked about that, and I think that's a pretty easy one to see. But this is the direction that our light's coming from. And then the next thing we're going to put in is our cast shadow. So this is going to be obviously the thing that the object casts, the shadow that the object casts on the floor or on the table. And that's going to be situated right here. Okay, next will be the reflected light, right? And this is light that kind of has bounced up off the table or bounced off of other things. And obviously the shinier your object is, the more you're going to have reflected light and the more you're going to have areas of highlight. So things like glass or ceramic, right? And that leads me to the last area, which is your highlights. And this is going to be obviously the brightest thing. We talked about this during the drawing, but this is really just going to be the white of the page is going to be the brightest area on your object. All right. So this is kind of the basics of drawing, right? Or of drawing shadows and dealing with shading. If you're going to begin to identify these areas as you're drawing and kind of go through the basic steps of figuring out the general shape and then figuring out like the shapes of the shadows, and beginning to tack those in, and then lightly layering up how dark something is, you'll end up with some really nicely drawn and shaded pieces. So thank you all so much for watching. That concludes the video. All right, have a great day.